My family accused me of flirting with my brother-in-law, then kicked me out into the winter cold. Now I'm thriving and gave them a gift they'll never heal from. I never believed that the people who were supposed to love you most could become your greatest enemies, until one winter night shattered every illusion I had about family loyalty. The betrayal came from those I trusted blindly, and it taught me that sometimes the cruelest wounds are inflicted by the hands that once promised to protect you. My name is Rachel Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. Today, as I sit in my corner office overlooking Manhattan's bustling streets, I'm a successful human rights attorney who fights for justice and defends the innocent. But 7 years ago, I was nothing more than a terrified college senior whose carefully constructed world imploded in a single, devastating evening. This is the story of how the people I trusted most became the very ones who tried to destroy me, and how I discovered that sometimes walking away isn't abandonment, it's the highest form of self-respect. The events that would forever change my life began in December 2016, during what should have been one of the most exciting times of my academic career. Just 3 weeks before my final law school exams, I was living at home with my parents, Linda and George Thompson, in the modest suburban house where I'd grown up. I had chosen to stay home during my final semester, partly to save money on rent, and partly because I thought being close to family would provide the emotional support I needed during such a stressful time. How wrong I was about everything. The house had become uncomfortably crowded since my older sister Sarah and her husband Mark had moved back in temporarily, after encountering some serious financial difficulties. Mark had lost his job at the local manufacturing plant, and Sarah's part-time work at a dental office wasn't enough to cover their apartment rent. What was supposed to be a short-term arrangement had stretched into several months, and the cramped living situation was beginning to wear on everyone's nerves. But I told myself it was just temporary. Once I graduated and started my legal career, I'd have my own place, and things would return to normal. Looking back now with the clarity that only distance and experience can provide, I can see all the warning signs I was too naive and trusting to recognize at the time. My mother had always shown a clear preference for Sarah. She was the golden child who could do no wrong, the daughter who fit perfectly into Mom's vision of what a proper young woman should be. Sarah was conventionally pretty, socially popular, and had followed the expected path of getting married young and settling down close to home. I, on the other hand, was the one who had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The daughter whose academic achievements were acknowledged with a brief nod before the conversation inevitably turned back to Sarah's latest drama or accomplishment. Sarah had always harbored a deep-seated jealousy toward my academic success, though she tried to disguise it behind a veneer of sisterly teasing. She would make cutting comments about me being a know-it-all or thinking I'm better than everyone else, whenever I discussed my studies or career aspirations. When I received academic honors or scholarships, she would minimize my achievements by saying things like, "Well, it's easy to get good grades when you have no social life, or I could have done that too if I'd wanted to waste my youth buried in books." At the time, I dismissed these remarks as normal sibling rivalry, the kind of harmless competition that exists in most families. I had no idea how deep her resentment ran, or how far she would go to tear me down. The atmosphere in our house had been growing increasingly tense for weeks leading up to that fateful night. Sarah and Mark were clearly experiencing serious marital problems, though no one in the family wanted to acknowledge the obvious signs. I would hear them arguing in hushed, angry whispers behind their bedroom door late at night, their voices carrying a bitterness that made me uncomfortable even through the walls. Mark had started spending more and more time downstairs, watching television alone until the early hours of the morning rather than going to bed with his wife. Meanwhile, Sarah had become increasingly irritable and volatile, snapping at everyone over the smallest infractions and constantly picking fights with me about trivial household matters like whose turn it was to do the dishes, who had left the bathroom light on, or who had used the last of the milk without replacing it. My parents, true to their conflict-avoidant nature, seemed completely oblivious to the real problems festering under their own roof. They chose instead to focus on maintaining the illusion that everything was fine, that we were just one big happy family going through a temporarily rough patch. Whenever tension arose during family dinners or casual conversations, Mom would quickly change the subject to something safer, like the weather or neighborhood gossip. Dad, meanwhile, would disappear to his workshop in the garage at the first sign of any emotional conflict. burying himself in his woodworking projects rather than dealing with the increasingly toxic atmosphere in his own home. I was so consumed with preparing for my final exams and planning my post-graduation job search that I didn't pay nearly enough attention to the family drama that was slowly building to an explosive climax around me. That night, the night that would divide my life into a clear before and after, started exactly like any other. I had been holed up in my childhood bedroom for hours, surrounded by law books and legal briefs, working on a particularly complex constitutional law case study that was due the following morning. The assignment was challenging and required deep analysis of several landmark Supreme Court decisions, and I was determined to produce my best work as I approached the finish line of my legal education. My desk was cluttered with highlighters, sticky notes, and empty coffee cups, the detritus of intensive studying that had become my constant companion during those final weeks of law school. Around 11 p.m., my stomach started growling loudly enough to break through my concentration. I realized I hadn't eaten anything since a hurried lunch 6 hours earlier, too focused on my studies to pay attention to basic human needs like hunger. The house was quiet and peaceful as I made my way downstairs to grab a quick snack before returning to my constitutional law marathon. My parents had retired to their bedroom around 10 o'clock, following their usual routine, and I assumed Sarah and Mark had done the same, finally calling a temporary truce in whatever battle they'd been waging behind closed doors. I made my way to the kitchen, appreciating the silence after hours of intense mental focus. I was in the process of making a simple peanut butter sandwich and reviewing my handwritten notes one more time when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mark appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking absolutely exhausted and emotionally drained. His usually neat hair was messy and unkempt, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd been tossing and turning, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of many sleepless nights. Despite the obvious stress he was under, we'd always maintained a friendly, comfortable relationship. He was actually one of the few people in the house who seemed genuinely interested in my studies and career goals, often asking thoughtful questions about my classes and offering encouragement about my future in law. "Hey Rachel," he said quietly, opening the refrigerator. "Still hitting the books?" "Unfortunately, yes," I replied, holding up my highlighter. "This constitutional law exam is going to be brutal. I'm reviewing landmark cases until my eyes bleed." He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "You know, I really admire your dedication. Sarah always talks about how smart you are, how you're going to be this hotshot lawyer someday." I was surprised to hear that Sarah spoke positively about me to her husband, given how she'd been treating me lately. "Really? She's been pretty critical of me recently." Mark's expression darkened. "She's been critical of everyone lately. Don't take it personally, she's going through a rough patch." We talked for maybe 10 minutes about my career plans, law school stress, and his work situation. It was a completely innocent conversation, the kind we'd had dozens of times before. Mark was giving me advice about networking and job interviews when we heard footsteps on the stairs. Sarah appeared in the doorway, and the temperature in the room instantly dropped. Her face was a mask of fury, her eyes darting between Mark and me with pure hatred. She was wearing her bathrobe, her hair disheveled, and she looked like she'd been crying. "What the hell is going on here?" she hissed. Mark and I both looked at her in confusion. "We're just talking," I said. "I was getting a snack and—" "Don't lie to me." Sarah's voice rose dangerously. "I know exactly what this is. I've been watching you, Rachel. The way you look at him, the way you find excuses to be around him when I'm not here." My mouth fell open. "Sarah, what are you talking about? We were just discussing my job interviews. At 11 o'clock at night? In your pajamas? Do you think I'm stupid?" I looked down at my outfit, flannel pajama pants and an oversized law school sweatshirt. Hardly seductive attire. I was studying in my room and came down for food. "This is ridiculous." "Sarah, honey, calm down," Mark interjected. "We really were just talking about her career. Nothing inappropriate happened." But Sarah was beyond reason. "Oh, so now you're defending her? That's just perfect." My own husband taking my little sister's side against me. The commotion had woken up my parents, who appeared in the kitchen looking alarmed. Mom immediately went to Sarah's side, while Dad stood in the doorway trying to assess the situation. "What's all this shouting about?" Mom demanded. Sarah burst into tears, throwing herself into Mom's arms. "I caught them together, Mom. Rachel was trying to seduce Mark right here in our kitchen. They've probably been carrying on behind my back for months." My blood ran cold. "That is absolutely not true." We were having a completely innocent conversation about job hunting. Mark, tell them. But Mark looked terrified, his eyes darting between his hysterical wife and my increasingly angry parents. It really was just a conversation, he said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Rachel Elizabeth Thompson. My mother's voice was like ice. How could you do this to your own sister? How could you betray your family like this? I didn't do anything, I protested, desperation creeping into my voice. This is insane. We were talking about constitutional law and job interviews. Nothing romantic or inappropriate happened. But my parents weren't listening. I could see the judgment forming in their eyes, the way they were already choosing sides. Sarah continued sobbing dramatically, adding details to her story that made it sound increasingly damning. She's been flirting with him for weeks, Sarah wailed. Always finding excuses to be around him, wearing those tight clothes, asking him personal questions about our marriage. I tried to ignore it, but tonight I caught them red-handed. I felt like I was in a nightmare. Tight clothes? I'm wearing pajamas. And what personal questions? I've never asked him anything about your marriage. Don't you dare lie to us, Dad finally spoke up, his voice heavy with disappointment. We raised you better than this, Rachel. This kind of behavior is unacceptable. The conversation spiraled from there. No matter what I said, no matter how much I protested my innocence, my family had already made up their minds. Sarah's tears and accusations carried more weight than my denials. Within an hour, my parents had made their decision. You need to leave, Mom said, her voice cold and final. Tonight. We won't have this kind of disruption in our home. Leave? Mom, I have finals in 3 weeks. This is my home too. Not anymore, Dad interrupted. You made your choice when you decided to go after your sister's husband. Pack your things and get out. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. You're throwing me out based on Sarah's word? You won't even consider that she might be wrong? Pack your things, Mom repeated. You have 1 hour. That hour was the longest and most painful of my life. I threw clothes into garbage bags, grabbed my textbooks and laptop, and tried to figure out where I could possibly go at midnight in December. My few close friends lived in dorms that required keycard access, and I didn't have money for a hotel. Sarah watched from her doorway as I packed, her tears miraculously dried up now that she'd gotten what she wanted. You brought this on yourself, she said smugly. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to steal someone else's husband. I stopped packing and looked at her directly. Sarah, why are you doing this? You know nothing happened. Why are you lying? For just a moment her mask slipped, and I saw something calculating in her eyes. But then she was back to playing the victim. Just leave, Rachel. You've done enough damage. My parents didn't even say goodbye. They stood in the living room, arms crossed, waiting for me to go. I kept hoping one of them would realize how crazy this was, would stop me and demand to hear my side of the story properly, but they just watched silently as I dragged my belongings to my car. The December air was brutal, and I sat in my car for 10 minutes, shivering and trying to figure out what to do. I had about $300 in my checking account, nowhere to sleep, and finals starting in less than 3 weeks. I felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I spent that first night in the 24-hour library on campus, dozing fitfully in a study carrel and jumping awake every time security made their rounds. The next few days were a blur of desperation and survival. I showered in the gym, ate vending machine food, and tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my world fell apart. After a week of essentially being homeless, I managed to find a tiny studio apartment in the worst part of town that I could barely afford. I got a job working the night shift at a fast food restaurant, coming home at 3 a.m. covered in grease and exhaustion, then trying to study during the day on no sleep. My grades that semester should have suffered tremendously, but anger became my fuel. Every time I wanted to give up, I thought about my family's betrayal, about how quickly they'd thrown me away based on lies. I studied with a fierce determination I'd never felt before, driven by the need to prove that I could succeed without them. Somehow, I not only passed my finals but graduated summa cum laude. I walked across that stage with no family in the audience, but with a job offer from a prestigious human rights law firm in New York. The full-ride scholarship I'd maintained throughout law school meant I graduated debt-free, and I moved to the city with a sense of liberation I'd never experienced. For 3 years, I threw myself into my career, I worked 60-hour weeks, took on pro bono cases for people who'd been wronged by the system, and built a reputation as a fierce advocate for justice. I made new friends, found mentors who believed in me, and slowly began to heal from the trauma of that night. I didn't hear from my family at all during this time. Not a single phone call, text message, or email. As far as they were concerned, I'd ceased to exist the moment I walked out their door. It hurt, but I began to build a life without them. Then, 3 years after I'd been kicked out, I got a call that changed everything. It was my high school friend Jenny, who still lived in my hometown. "Rachel, I thought you should know," she said carefully. "Sarah and Mark are getting divorced. It's all over town. Apparently Sarah was having an affair with her coworker for over 2 years. Mark found out and filed for divorce last week." The irony hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had been cheating on her husband while accusing me of trying to seduce him. She'd destroyed my relationship with my family to cover up her own infidelity. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. "There's more," Jenny continued. "Mark's been telling people what really happened that night. He's saying you were completely innocent, that Sarah set the whole thing up because she was feeling guilty about her affair and needed someone to blame." I sat in my Manhattan office, looking out at the skyline, and felt a mixture of vindication and rage. My innocence had finally been proven, but it was 3 years too late. 3 years of exile, of building a life without family support, of wondering if I'd somehow deserved what happened to me. A week later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my mother's number. "Rachel?" Mom's voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "Honey, it's Mom. We need to talk." I'd imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was happening, I felt surprisingly calm. "What do you want, Linda?" The use of her first name clearly stung. "Don't be like that, sweetheart. We know the truth now about what really happened. Sarah told us everything. We know you were innocent." "You know I was innocent," I repeated slowly. "After 3 years of no contact, you're calling to tell me what I already knew the night you threw me out." "We made a mistake," she said, her voice getting smaller. "We're sorry. We want you to come home, to be a family again. Now you want me to come home." I leaned back in my executive chair. "Tell me, what changed?" "Why now?" There was a pause. "Well, we miss you, of course. And we've been reading about you online, seeing how successful you've become. We're proud of you, honey." And there it was. They'd looked me up, seen my professional achievements, my salary, my success. They weren't calling because they'd realized how badly they'd wronged me. They were calling because they wanted to be associated with my success. "I see. So when you thought I was a family-destroying seductress, I was dead to you. But now that I'm a successful attorney who might be useful to have around, suddenly you miss me." "That's not fair, Rachel. We admitted we made a mistake." "You made a mistake," I said, tasting the bitterness of those words. "You destroyed your daughter's life over a lie, and you're calling it a mistake." Over the next few weeks, the calls and texts kept coming. My father joined in, sending awkward messages about wanting to rebuild our relationship. Sarah even reached out, sending a long email about how sorry she was, and how we needed to move past this for the sake of the family. I ignored most of them, but the persistence finally wore me down. I agreed to meet them for dinner at a restaurant in my hometown, neutral territory where they couldn't ambush me or try to manipulate me with family photos and childhood memories. The drive back to my hometown felt surreal. I hadn't been there in 3 years, and seeing the familiar streets brought back a flood of memories, both good and devastating. I'd made this drive so many times as a hopeful young woman excited to share my achievements with my family. Now I was returning as a stranger. They were already seated when I arrived, all 3 of them looking older and somehow smaller than I remembered. My parents had aged visibly, with new lines around their eyes and gray in their hair. Sarah looked defeated, her face puffy and worn in a way that suggested the divorce had been brutal. "Rachel!" Mom jumped up to hug me, but I stepped back and simply took my seat. The rejection clearly hurt her, but I wasn't ready for physical affection from people who'd shown me none when I needed it most. "You look wonderful," Dad said, his voice overly bright, "so professional and successful. We're really proud of you." "Are you?" I asked quietly. "When exactly did that pride start? Because I don't remember feeling any support from you 3 years ago." An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Sarah was the first to speak. "Rachel, I owe you a huge apology," she began, her voice shaky. "What I did was unforgivable. I was going through a really difficult time in my marriage, and I made terrible choices. I never should have accused you of something you didn't do. You're right, I said simply. You shouldn't have. She seemed to expect more. Forgiveness, understanding, sisterly bonding. When I didn't provide it, she pressed on. I know I hurt you, but we're family. Family forgives each other and moves on. We can get past this, can we? I looked around the table. Let me ask you something. During these 3 years, how many times did any of you consider that you might have been wrong? How many times did you think about reaching out to hear my side of the story? More silence. I'll answer for you. Never. Not once. You were perfectly comfortable having me completely cut out of your lives because it was easier than admitting you'd made a mistake. That's not true, Mom protested. We thought about you all the time. We missed you. But not enough to pick up the phone. Not enough to question Sarah's story. You missed me, but you didn't want me back until you found out I was successful. Dad leaned forward. Look, Rachel. We know we handled things badly. But dwelling on the past isn't going to help anyone. We want to move forward as a family. Move forward, I repeated. You want to move forward. What does that look like to you? Well, Mom said eagerly, you could move back home for a while, save some money, and maybe you could help us out a little. We're having some financial struggles, and with your salary. There it was. The real reason for this reunion. They didn't want their daughter back, they wanted my income. I see. So let me understand this correctly. You threw me out based on a lie, cut me off completely for 3 years, and now you want me to come home and subsidize your lifestyle. It's not like that, Sarah interjected. We're family. Family helps each other out during tough times. Family helps each other out, I said slowly. Where was the family help when I was sleeping in the library because you'd made me homeless 3 weeks before finals? Where was the family help when I was working night shifts and living on ramen noodles? We didn't know. Mom started. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. You made your choice that night, and I've been living with the consequences ever since. The conversation continued for another hour, but it became increasingly clear that they hadn't really changed. They weren't genuinely sorry for the pain they'd caused. They were sorry that their actions had consequences for them. They wanted the benefits of having a successful daughter without acknowledging the damage they'd done to our relationship. As the evening wound down, my father made one last attempt. Rachel, you're our daughter. You'll always be our daughter. Don't you think it's time to forgive and forget? To come home? I looked at these 3 people who shared my DNA, but had shown me that biology doesn't guarantee love, loyalty, or even basic fairness. I thought about the life I'd built in New York, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. You know what? I said, standing up from the table. You're right about one thing. I am your daughter. And you taught me some valuable lessons that night 3 years ago. What lessons? Mom asked hopefully. You taught me that some people will throw you away the moment you become inconvenient. You taught me that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. And most importantly, you taught me that I'm strong enough to build a life without people who don't truly value me. I pulled out my wallet and left money on the table for my untouched meal. But here's what you didn't teach me. What I had to learn on my own. I deserve better than conditional love. I deserve relationships built on trust and respect, not manipulation and convenience. And I've found that. Just not with you. Rachel, please, Sarah called as I headed for the door. Don't do this, we can fix this. I turned back one last time. You can't fix what you refuse to acknowledge you broke. You want forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without apology, and benefits without relationship. That's not how healing works. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The closure I'd been seeking wasn't an apology or acknowledgement. It was the realization that I no longer needed their validation to know my worth. The drive back to New York was peaceful. I called my chosen family, my mentor Patricia, my best friend Marcus, my colleague and confidante Elena, and told them about the dinner. They listened without judgment, offered support without conditions, and reminded me why I'd been right to build a life without people who could discard me so easily. That was 2 years ago. I haven't spoken to my biological family since that dinner, and I don't plan to. I've learned that family isn't about shared DNA. It's about shared values, mutual respect, and unconditional support. I've found my real family among the people who choose to love me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I'm now a partner at my firm, specializing in cases involving family estrangement and wrongful accusations. I help people who've been cast out by their families, who've been victims of false allegations, who've had to rebuild their lives from nothing. It's given new meaning to my legal career and helped me turn my pain into purpose. Sometimes people ask if I regret not giving my family another chance, if I think I was too harsh in cutting them off permanently, but I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and healing doesn't require keeping toxic people in your life. My biological family taught me who I didn't want to be, and my chosen family has shown me who I can become. They threw me away when they thought I was worthless, and tried to reclaim me when they thought I was valuable. But I've learned that my worth was never theirs to determine. In the end, I realized that sometimes walking away isn't giving up, it's growing up. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that doesn't match your worth. And sometimes the family that loves you best is the one you choose, not the one you're born into. I haven't looked back since, and I never will, because I finally understand that I don't need to beg for love from people who are only capable of giving it conditionally. I've built a life surrounded by people who would never dream of throwing me away, and that's worth more than any biological connection